I'd like to start, I think that Bernard set up the large stakes extremely well at the beginning, as always, and what I'd like to start with is one of the questions that he raised, which is the multiplicity, even contradictions around the notion of entropy at the origin of cybernetics. And what I'll try to do over the 30 minutes is to play with that problem within cybernetics, the difference and even contradiction between entropy and information theory and entropy in the sort of biological sense. And then to show some of its impact today in contemporary cognitive science, which really, I think, has now become a dominant paradigm. OK. Comme ça. OK. So I will start then with that idea, which is the contradiction in some ways, or at least the difference between what Shannon introduced with information theory, his theory of entropy, and the biological. But rather than start with the technical terms, I'll say that the problem emerges, I think, with the idea of homeostasis, which is so central to biology in the 20th century, but also to cybernetics and the idea of the machine. And the point here that I want to draw on is that with Walter Cannon, who introduces this idea, it is not simply about a mechanism, it's also about a confrontation with the possibility of disillusion, so kind of more like an existential battle. So the role that these adjustments play in the life of an organism is actually to be constantly fighting, you might say, against the possibility of this entity disintegrating when it's subjected to stress. So this is what homeostasis is. It's not equilibrium, it's not anything mild, it's actually a conflict between the forces of disorder, you might say, or stress, and how the organism can maintain itself. So this is where I think we can see the obvious link between early biological theory and Schrodinger's famous effort in What is Life to define the living being as something that can actually produce positive, or to produce negative entropy against these forces of dissolution, which is the physical definition in thermodynamics of entropy. So how do we keep alive? It's by avoiding the states where entropy increases and by somehow, as he says, feeding off of negative entropy. And this is where the conflicts and the difficulties and the contradictions arise. What does it mean to take in negative entropy? It's not merely energy, it can't simply be that. And yet, how does external order become interiorized or reorganized within an organism that has its own, as you might say in this period, its own aims, its own goals, its own integration? So when we come to cybernetics, I think there's a lot of analogy between Schrodinger's ideas and this biological concept that through Cannon comes into cybernetics, which is this one, that there's an active process, not simply to maintain norms within the entity, whether it's a machine or an organism, but to actually fight against the inevitability of entropy as a physical process. And what I'd like to note here, which I think is an important theme, it's not simply an automatic or at least equilibrium process that is benign again, but I'll note two things. One, it's about making decisions. In other words, there is again a kind of moment of indecision or a moment of conflict or emergency where the entity may well suffer the possibility of destruction. The second thing is that it is able to do that, and this is the first hint that we have of what negative entry might be in cybernetics, is it produces a zone of organization. And I'd like to keep that idea in mind, is that it produces a frontier or a boundary against the forces of entropy. So in some ways, negative entropy is not simply about an internal mechanism, but it's the maintaining of a boundary. And I want to take this up later, so it's important. So I think you're right that we can see this in many different contexts in this period. They have technical differentiations. Bertalanffy is not the same as cybernetics and so on. But again, the same terms are used, and even though this is a late text, Bertalanffy was using this same kind of concept even in the 1940s, which is that a living organism must be doing something to import or to at least take something from outside and produce organization against the increase of entropy, which could even lead, as he says, to increased order and organization, which I think Lotka is also interested in. Now the key term here is the open system, and that's how Bertalanffy distinguished between, in some ways, an uninteresting and not dynamic and adaptive system, a closed system, which in thermodynamic terms will probably run down. But he talks about an open system. And here again, I think the idea of the boundary is extremely difficult, because what does it mean for a system to be open to the outside, and yet at the same time maintain the boundary? And so it's not clear what the transition between outside and inside is in either cybernetics or in the systems theory that comes out of biology like Bertalanffy's. Now, one way that this could be resolved, I think, would be the idea that within the cybernetic entity itself, there is something like an information machine that can help maintain both the state of the internal organism and the external situation or environment through the advanced organs of sensation and how they are interpreted by, let's say, an information processor. And that is exactly the way we see often the way that the brain and the nervous system is understood in these texts, which is it's an information processor, and that had extremely important implications for the development of psychology in the period. But to be consistent, the cyberneticists like Ashby recognized that the brain could not operate under different principles. It itself must be also a homeostatic entity. And this was the drive of cybernetic theory around the brain, which is to understand its own self-organization based on principles of homeostasis. In other words, we couldn't have an information processor that somehow worked on different principles if the organism was going to be a homeostatic organism. So what is the function then of an information processor in the midst of a biological organism? In other words, what role does this new organ play in a homeostatic organization, which begins even with the single cell? So there's many different ways that cyberneticists dealt with this. This is the famous model of Pitts and McCulloch on the brain as a Turing machine. But really what we have to pay attention to is the intervention of Shannon, who is constantly quoted, never quite assimilated, for this reason, is that Shannon's theory of information really has one analog with thermodynamical entropy, which is the equation looks somewhat similar to those equations that are used in thermodynamics. But in fact, if you look at how he defines these terms, what he's really arguing is something that almost seems to be the opposite of thermodynamic entropy, which is in an information system, the more uncertainty there is, the more possibility, in other words, the more information is available. In other words, high entropy systems are actually more interesting because they offer unpredictability and therefore something that we can learn. A system that has low entropy would be one that is completely and utterly predictable and therefore would offer no information. So what we have is the idea of a thermodynamic system with increasing entropy actually becomes more and more uninteresting, whereas an information system, it's really the opposite. But in some ways there's also fewer analogies because the definition of terms is quite different. But ultimately what Shannon was arguing was that the idea of high entropy was surprise because of the low probability of an event. We learn a lot from that, especially when it counters expectation. So this, rather than the technical interaction between these different ideas, I like to kind of keep this conceptual one in mind, which is the idea of predictability, which has become so essential in thinking about biology, but particularly thinking about the way that the brain operates today as a kind of Bayesian predictive system. Okay, so if we have this idea of difference between information and let's call it the biological homeostat, we can't think as we might easily decide that Wiener's idea of control and communication is something that an information machine can directly intervene and therefore provide this solution to the problem of a negative entropic organism. In other words, how does the information system, which operates on a different logic of entropy, according to Shannon, how does that actually solve the problem of the homeostatic biological organism itself? So I think one way that we need to address this is by understanding Shannon's work around information theory and the way that that expectation is so important for him, with another way that biology introduces concepts in this period, which are in some ways homeostatic, but emphasize much more what we would call the sensory system or the information system of the biological organism. So von Uexküll's famous work from 1920 involves the feedback circle, which is not merely a mechanism. What he really argued was quite radical, which is that the world that we live in is constructed by this information system. It's not that we have an interface or a conduit to the external world. We construct the world and respond to that construction with new flows of information that are transformed into this world and then are organized within even the simplest world of an insect. So this is extremely important because it will allow us to group better the way that homeostasis within the organism and within the information organs, the way that they could be brought closer together. So this is one way we can think about this. In cybernetics, one of the key ideas that was promulgated even before the term was this idea that teleology needed to be redescribed as something without a metaphysical importance, but actually in terms of essentially goal-directed behavior. Now, goals obviously have to be present in order to be responded to, but one thing that Wiener and his colleagues emphasized in this early work was that there's different ways that machines or animals can respond to goals. And what was important for them was this division between what they call predictive and non-predictive behavior. And the reason this is important in relation to von Uexküll is because, of course, no entity lives in the future. It has to construct internally a future, and then it responds to that future construction. So this is what happens when, as they say, an animal running after another animal cannot actually chase the present animal. It has to anticipate where this is heading. So you can even then have higher orders of prediction. You might have the cat chasing the mouse, where it has to predict one order of movement. But as they say, throwing a stone at a moving target requires another level of prediction. In other words, the path of the object, the weapon, the path of the prey, and also perhaps your own movement. And this is very much linked with the military technologies of the time. These were the problems that cybernetics had to deal with in its earliest phases. How do you shoot down, for example, a moving target in a military context? It's all about prediction. But if we look back to von Uexküll, we can see that this idea of the construction is not anything complicated because the present is also a construction. There is only construction. So we're responding to our own constructions of the world, is what cybernetics here is articulating. Now, what's interesting in this article, however, is that they use this idea of prediction and the levels of prediction to isolate the human by saying there's even higher levels of prediction, which include, say, using weaponry. But I want you to note here the introduction of technology. They mention the sling or a bow and arrow. These are, of course, new organizations that themselves require a kind of predictive power. In other words, to make the instrument itself requires us to construct a future and to make it real, and it is one that is radically non-natural, as we know. So again, this takes directly, I think, from the actual working environment of the cyberneticist around weaponry. But it occludes, it really does repress this problem of the origin of technology. Where does this new prediction come in that is not, as I would say, defined solely by the sensory motor system as it is with other kinds of prediction, even complex predictions that require us to construct futures that are not yet present. So this is where they actually will argue that this is one of the discontinuities that would define the human, is the human is capable of higher orders of prediction. But what I'd like to ask then is, within the cybernetic context first, what exactly would be that potential if we define it as prediction beyond given sensory motor feedback loops? In other words, the kinds of predictions that the brain can make based on its own historical memory. Because, as we know from Leroy-Gourand and others, the tool requires a different kind of, it's not a prediction so much based on the past, it's a novel future that has absolutely no necessary connection with past experience. Okay, well, one way that I think that this begins to merge together as a problem in this period is through the idea that we take the information theory context as central, rather than try to build the model of the organism as a system that is homeostatic in the thermodynamic sense with a control mechanism. We have instead the idea that the control mechanism as an information system, in fact, is the model for the whole physical system. So I just have one quote here from Popper, but we can see this coming in a number of different places. We have the idea that the organism can be understood as a problem solver. And what problem solving means for Popper and for Michael Polanyi as well is making hypotheses to solve challenges in the moment, and then eliminating error if those tests are not successful. And they define the evolution of an organism as the inheritance of successful hypothetical tests in concrete, specific environments. So there we can see, even at the very lowest level, without complex nervous systems, that the whole organism is understood as a bounded entity that can hypothesize about its environment, create experiments essentially, and then also correct given the possibility of error. So when we come, this is a very quick history or a very schematic one, but when we come to see the importance in cognitive science and then AI, the importance of embodied cognition as a sort of a new paradigm in the 1980s, I think one way that we can think of autopoiesis and related concepts is precisely this model of the organism as a whole testing its environment by predicting new possibilities for itself based on the history of its own experiences. So that the difference between mind and body then is not really all that important. What's important is, does the nervous system add new possibilities of both historical memory and predictive hypothesis? So by defining an organism as they do here, it's a little cryptic, but the idea is that, again, a bounded organization is a closed domain with only so many possible states, what we would call a state space, and that the value of the organism's organization is that it allows it to realize certain states that are successful in a changing environment. And here, I think, is a really important sign that this original problem, the problem of what we might say the difference between a radical new behavior and one that is, in some ways, a prediction based only on a kind of inductive model, is their idea that memory cannot just simply be a mechanical system where we store representations and then use that in the present, but the whole organism must be seen as a system that modifies itself by synthesizing new behavior. So it's that word synthesizing now, I think that's important, is that the organism does not simply respond with more information from the past, it reorganizes itself by synthesizing a new behavior that takes into account both past experience, present information, and possibilities of the future. And that's, of course, why they can then say that advanced nervous systems offer increasing opportunities of synthesis. But the question of synthesis is absolutely unexplained in this model. Synthesis in a radical sense. How does a bounded organization ever produce what we might call a non-necessary or a predictive future that has no connection, let's say, with a past experience? Okay, so a couple of options in this period would be to turn sort of back to entropy and to say, in some ways, as Bateson did, that the way we can understand complex organizations and information systems as producing radical novelty is because of the noise and error and disruptions of the system. So Bateson is one person that develops this idea. Atlan is another one, famously in the 70s, with his idea that noise could itself be the principle of self-organization. But you can see that, don't read this, it's okay, it's just an example. But we can see that this is not really enough, because with Atlan, for example, it's all just about a kind of internal civil war between order and disorder. It's not really a new conception of, let's say, how an ordered, self-organized system could produce novelty, radical novelty. It's really an idea that there's always just a war, let's say, a war between entropy and negative entropy within the organism. I don't think that's very powerful. In any way, I'd like to just now see how this pays off actually in some contemporary work and what the implications are. So the basic model that has to be entertained with any contemporary cognitive science goes back to the Hebbian idea that plasticity of the brain, synaptic use improves weights, but they can change based on experience and so on. That's the foundation of any model of the brain's activity. And it's linked with what is now the dominant model again for pretty much any cerebral activity, which is the neural network. Now the artificial neural network drew attention to the ways that information can be transformed, not through sequential computation, but through transformations of patterning. And I think, again, we can kind of look at this from the perspective of von Uxküll and say, once information or data is translated into the network nodes, it's the organization and reorganization within the neural network that produces the outputs. It's not an interface with a reality. So these depend, this is just the kind of basic way that these things are schematized, but the main idea is that it does have a kind of, if not mechanical, at least an orderly process, that it's in the distribution and aggregation of these many different events that we produce these kind of flexible behaviors in the brain. So this is just a kind of foundational principle, let's say, of a contemporary theory of cognition that is linked with the brain, that something like a neural network is what organizes and reorganizes information once it's come into the system from outside, but there's still a boundary between those two things. So the question then is, how do these machines learn if we take learning to be a more radical problem than simply the transformation of experience? In other words, how do we model the learning of a complex entity like the brain, which really has absolutely no direct contact with the outside world? So generally in cognitive science, what we have is two ways of looking at a neural network. One is a feed-forward network where all of the information is transformed in one direction, and then we have an output. But with the more complex systems today, what we have is, of course, double direction neural networks. And this is the development that's taken place in machine learning and particularly deep learning, which is to say why we can have what are called unsupervised networks, ones that don't require external help. They recognize error, and then when mistakes are made, they backpropagate the error to readjust the weights in order to make a better inference about what the output should be. Now, this is something that comes out of machine learning and deep learning, but then it re-enters cognitive science through new models that try to understand the brain not as a complex, deep system that interprets information, but as one that takes advantage of the economy of a predictive network, so it's not always computing the state of the world as it seems. What it's doing in this paradigm, which is called predictive processing, which is becoming extremely important in both philosophy and also in cognitive science. The idea is that the brain predicts the world and then only pays attention to the errors. In other words, it only pays attention to what is surprising. So, and this is called surprisal, so you don't think of it as always like affective. So the point here then is it links now this Shannon idea of entropy with homeostasis more directly. What we have is, when we have predictions that surprise us because they're not right, we pay attention to the error and then update the model or imagine possible consequences of our bodily actions that could change the world to be in line with our predictions. So it's a theory of both the predictive brain, but also the way that our actions are in fact driven by our imagination. Not only now do we construct a world, we also construct fictional worlds where our body would say be in a different place, and then correct for the errors of the fact that we're not in that place. This is now how we explain through this model motor activity and action. So the point here is to say the success of the organism in avoiding surprise is by paying attention to surprise. So the information system takes advantage of the high entropy states in order to then allow, once it knows that they're wrong, to change the way that the organism is orienting to the world. Whether it's an internal milieu or the external, the idea is that the high entropy states of information allow the organism to avoid danger. So this now comes back then as a kind of, goes back to Helmholtz, but it goes also back to Popper and these other theorists, which is to say, perception is again now a kind of hypothesis. The brain is not connected to the outside. It keeps generating models from within its own system, and then those models are either confirmed or disconfirmed and updated appropriately. So the point that comes back now is through Carl Friston, one of the important theorists that has introduced these ideas. He's at the Wellcome Institute in London, is the free energy principle, which now borrows a term from thermodynamics, Gibbsian free energy, but it's now actually understood in the information theoretic context, which is to say, free energy is the measure of the surprise on data. In other words, it's the maximum, you might say, of uncertainty. Now, why is this important? Well, Friston now again wants to expand this idea of the free energy principle to the whole organism and also to what we might call larger systems, or what Bernard perhaps will call exo-organic systems. And I think this is where we really wanted to think about the implications of this idea. Just to repeat it, to make it clear, the idea now is that entropy, which is the tendency disorder, is countered not by some mysterious force or anything, but by the principle that any system, it doesn't have to be organismic even, any system tries to minimize free energy, which is surprise. Whether it's a projection of a predictive Bayesian brain, or whether it's a single-celled organism that is attempting to maintain its own organization, is when things don't happen, that's what introduces this possibility of fighting against disorder. Okay, so as he says here, I won't read out the whole quote. It's, in essence, what's happening is that any organism, even ones without a nervous system, are predicting what will happen next, acting according to that, and then countering surprising violations of those predictions. In other words, that's how we would define life, as something that can respond to a prediction error. So one term that we might want to think about here, which hopefully you haven't heard of because it's quite new and I haven't heard of it. So it brings in this notion, what's called a Markov Blanket, which is a new way of defining what Wiener called that zone of organization. And the Markov Blanket is a way that organisms or other systems can create a boundary that allows for a certain kind of predictability within its zone. In other words, it's the marking off of an exterior and an interior. And a simple example would be the biological cell. But we can also think of an organism as a larger Markov blanket with what are called, children blankets inside of it. We may well also want to identify other systems as having the same possibility of marking an interior against an exterior, so that information and order can be redistributed, reorganized within, in order to maintain this kind of equilibrium or homeostasis. So just in conclusion, do I have some time left? I'll show how this comes into play with a more specific philosophical theory of cognition, which is predictive processing as a kind of model for understanding how not just the brain works, but how cognition evolves up through evolution and in the human. So here are two books that show how it's coming to be to the fore in some domains. First, Howey's book, The Predictive Mind, and then Andy Clark, who you may know from his work on the extended mind, Surfing Uncertainty. So the basic idea there, which is what I've just sketched out, is that all perception, but not only perception, cognition itself, as well as action, motor action, are all linked with this same regime, which is one of prediction, error, and error correction. And the most radical theory really is around the action, but it's actually shown to be quite effective in robotics, for example. So the point here again is to say that, like with von Uexküll and earlier theories, the imagination is where this happens. In other words, there's something in the brain that allows us to create novel predictions and then to test them. We never actually live in a present, we live in the constant near future, let's say, of our predictive models. And this is what we see now as a general kind of definition of intelligence in the deep learning era. But we really have to pay attention to what the argument is about intelligence, since this doesn't seem to distinguish at all between other higher mammals and the human. So this is a way that we can see how the architecture of something like predictive processing works. The important thing here is generative model, which comes from the deep learning work of Geoffrey Hinton in AI, but it's all about prediction and correction, desired states and so on, whether it's on the body or whether it's our acting on the world. So I'll just quickly go back to the origin of some of these ideas of neural network to introduce one complication linked with the complication I noted in cybernetics, which is the early theories of neural network organization in the 1980s. It's a similar idea that we have right now, which is you have the environment producing inputs, and then there's an internal organization through neural network that produces an output. And the way that they want to look at that is to say it's not quite so simple because the internal units are always organizing to predict what is happening outside in the world, and so the outputs are tested by the environment. So this idea of a model is extremely important because we only live within the model. So the model is constantly changing as inputs change and as our experience changes. Now what's really great about this early work is that they recognized the problem of what we might call genuine intelligence. If we settle into solutions through these network predictions and error corrections as processes, rather than applying actual logical operations, why are humans so intelligent? What is the difference between a human who operates by categories of logic or science or mathematics? How do we move from these distributed predictive Bayesian systems to something like controlled cognition? And here's where we get a very interesting answer. We suspect it comes, they say, from our ability to create artifacts, which is that problem of the tool in cybernetics. Where does this radical invention intervene in human evolution? And by artifact, they mean a physical representation that we then manipulate in ways that are not identical to the kinds of organizations that take place, let's call it within the Markov blanket of the neural system. And this is, I think, where they specify something that is very much linked with the problem that we've been interested in around exteriorization, which is that we create external artifacts that we can think with and then internalize those representations. We can imagine something, an alien logic, internal, and then use them as part of our process of prediction. That is something that only the human can do. So this seems to be a new question then. It's not so much how do models get generated and then errors corrected through attention and so on, but how is it that the human is capable of, as Bernard would say, exteriorizing thought into an external artifact and then interiorizing it to produce a completely different way of thinking. Now, they say this is the reason that imagining an external representation operating on that is so powerful. It is what they call real symbol processing. And to see that recognized in the 80s with the originators of deep learning, Geoffrey Hinton, for example, it's quite astonishing. It's the primary symbol processing that we're able to do. Indeed, on this view, the external environment becomes a key extension to our mind. And you can see it's not us predicting or extending the mind in a facile way. It's actually changing the mind, putting it somewhere where it isn't. Now, it's interesting that this is the problem. To invent new external representation seems to be a kind of paradoxical one. You have to have an insight into the problem to be solved to invent this novelty, which is a philosophical problem that obviously it's an understatement to say it's the highest human intellectual ability. But where do they come from? The answer is they come from culture. So it's not surprising that this problem was completely repressed and doesn't appear, again, in the contemporary machine learning world. But it's come back through Andy Clark, and this is where I will end. Andy Clark has a theory of the extended mind. It's a problematic one, but he is trying to bring now into play what is the role of technology and external cognition in the model of predictive processing. So he knows, for example, that we use tools, strategies, external memory. He has ideas and suggestions about how computer memory could be analogous to our brain memory. And he calls this our metamorphic mental world. And you can see in the title, he's suggesting that humans, unlike animals, knit their own Markov blankets. In other words, they are capable of creating those zones of organization beyond the cerebral entity itself. Now, what that really means is unclear in Clark's own world because he doesn't stress or he doesn't read, let's say, that problem of exteriorization very carefully. One way to put that is in Clark's use of the predictive processing model, the predictive aspect and the ability to create these loops of prediction and correction, they never are genuinely what we would call anticipation, because the system is always only in one state. So one thing that we might want to think about here is that Clark is on the right track of trying to think about how this evolved brain system as an information system within a homeostatic organism is doing something novel. But is it possible, this would be the question that I would raise, is it possible to integrate the question that we know from Leroy-Gourand and Merlin-Donald, that above all from Bernard, about the constitutive role of exteriorization? Can we think about how to integrate some of the insights of exteriorization with the insights of predictive processing? Because the problem seems to be right there on where is it that the natural boundary, the Markov blanket of cognition in the wild, we might say, was not just extended in a kind of simplistic way, but actually broken and reorganized outside of the body. That's something that I think that it's not enough simply to point to the criticism of exteriorization in technology. I think the challenge is also for us to think, how do we think exteriorization in the context of contemporary cognitive science? Thank you.